Lecture 14 for Western Civ 1. The Byzantine Contributions to Western Civilization. What we find is that the Romans left a great legacy. They'd accumulated things from all over the place, and they left a great legacy to subsequent Western civilization in Europe. Some of that will come from their eastern heirs, however, and the Byzantine Empire is the eastern half of the Roman Empire that persists. It's going to persist up until 1453, when Constantinople is finally conquered by the Ottoman Turks. The Byzantine Empire received a large legacy from Greco-Roman civilization, and its people persisted for centuries to consider themselves Roman, even though they would, for much of that time, have no influence over the city of Rome and didn't speak Latin. They spoke Greek. Their culture, though, faced by challenges, was not static. They just didn't hold on to things Roman. They maintained some things at a very high level, and they would continue on to be creative and develop some new inventions along the way. They will change over the millennium that the Byzantine Empire existed, and certainly they will come back to fertilize the thinking of the West along the way as they encounter the West. That will happen after Justinian and his forces go seeking to conquer Italy, but it will happen later on, particularly in the time period of the Crusades, and as they encounter the West, they're going to continue to pass on things that they've maintained in the East that are sometimes forgotten in the West. Geographical separation, cultural variation, political rivalry, and religious schism certainly contributed to a less than amicable relationship between the East and the West. And in the early Byzantine period, the West certainly needed the help of the East and didn't get that much help. They only received assistance insofar as it served the purposes of the Byzantine emperors. As time proceeded, the once powerful Byzantines became vulnerable, particularly with the continued onslaught of the Persians and then of the Muslims, and they received only grudging and self-seeking support from the West. But without the Byzantines, Western civilization certainly would be different. So as we begin to think here about the Byzantines, we saw earlier in the late Roman time period that you had a great deal of continuity with the Roman emperor, same style rulers, where you have emperors who act as Caesaro-Papists, Caesars who are very much concerned about controlling things in the church. In the East, they continue to have the same capital at Constantinople. They maintain much of the same territory and same high standard of living with long-distance trade, with solid economics, with coinage that is made of fairly pure metals, maintaining a fairly large population, and urban centers. Urban centers continue to be very important here in the Byzantine Empire that's going to emerge here from Rome. They'll persist in worshiping as Christians, although there'll be some fragmentation. They'll maintain some of the same institutions, particularly in regard to cultural institutions like bathhouses and chariot racing, and they'll continue to build the same sorts of monumental architecture on a very large scale. They'll continue to build churches on a very large scale, and what we'll find is the early Byzantine period here was a time of cultural fluorescence and continued contact with the West up through the reign of Justinian. But as we begin here today to talk about the Middle Byzantine period, we will see that the successors of Justinian found themselves faced with new challenges, as they were always fighting against the Persians in the East. Heraclius, the Roman emperor, the Byzantine emperor here, who ruled from 610 until 641, was confronted with ongoing challenges, and some of his actions and these external forces that press in on the Byzantine Empire will contribute to diminishing their territory and contributing somewhat towards a decline. First of all, we have continued Slavic migrations as people come down from the north because of the changing economic situation and the like, and so they're going to be continually fighting against Slavic persons who are migrating down into the Balkan Peninsula, and Constantinople will in fact be besieged at times. But they're going to be able to fight that off. But it's the renewed war with the Sassanid Persians between the year 602 and 628 that really makes a great challenge, as Palestine will be invaded in the year 618. These Zoroastrian Persians will certainly attack Christian institutions like church buildings and seek to take away movable wealth to plunder those places. And eventually, Heraclius is able to defeat the Persians in battle in the year 627 at Nineveh, and this is going to weaken both the Byzantines and the Sassanids and make them vulnerable to the subsequent Islamic incursions that come from the south. So you basically have two great civilizations, great heavyweights fighting against each other, fighting a 16-round fight, and then you have a relative flyweight come into the battle here after the 16th round, and that flyweight would be the Islamic invaders that come along, and they're going to be able to defeat both the Sassanid Persians and the Byzantines because of their mutual exhaustion. The Islamic invasion takes place after the death of Muhammad. Muhammad had consolidated control of things in Arabia, but then his successors will press forward, moving up into the Transjordan, fighting battles at Jerusalem, and then eventually a great battle at the Battle of the Yarmouk in 636, and they'll press within that first generation all the way towards the gates of Constantinople and across North Africa. And they'll find that many people will come to ally with them along the way, as there are certain benefits that they offered economically to people who converted to Islam. This is going to be a major challenge for the Byzantine emperors, who are the secular leaders of the church. Their great achievement in this early period, this early part of the middle period, is that they survive. They survive this, but as we assess their efforts here, we see that they're not always led by the strongest of leaders, and they're particularly weakened by internal dissension and something of a loss of identity, as people don't feel a whole lot of enfranchisement in this empire, as the king has taken on more regal trappings, the emperor's taken on more regal trappings, and there's been some economic regression. They've lost territory and subsequently a population base, and that's going to contribute towards urban decline and a breakdown of long-distance trade, and it leads to problems with prices, and this is particularly going to be a problem as the emperors maintain monopolies in certain areas. But what we find is the Byzantines continue to pass on a legacy. They maintain their legal tradition. They continue to build great architecture, particularly in the area of church work. They will continue to fund some artistic and other pieces of artwork, visual arts and the like. But there will continue to be challenges as they are divided amongst Monophysites, particularly down in Egypt, and other local groups under the Byzantines that sometimes identified with older traditions, and so we'll find that there are the roots of division amongst the Armenians, the Assyrians, and other religious groups that maintain their local religious heritage as Christians with a local heritage. As we come towards the end of this Middle Byzantine period, though, we'll see that there's retrenchment and increasing isolation from the West. The military battles have certainly drained a lot of their economy, and they're going to have internal disputes, dynastic disputes. And as we come towards the year 800, there was some prospect of trying to reunite the East and the West. In fact, there was a proposed marriage alliance between the Empress Irene and Charlemagne, who we'll talk about in the West here at a later time. But there were also issues that existed between the East and the West that divided them. One of the main issues that arose was one that is seen to be connected with the advance of Islam. What we find is that in the year 695, the Emperor Justin II had put the image of Christ on his coins. Now, prior to this, you've had the typical heads and tails type of coins. You have the obverse with a head of the emperor, oftentimes in a full frontal sort of presentation, as opposed to the Romans' habit of a profile. But lots of Christian imagery on these coins. But something that was different here with Justin II would be that he's going to put the image of Jesus on these coins. It's not a very detailed picture, but this would be something that would cause problems, particularly with the Muslims who have been continuing to use the Byzantines' high-grade coins along the way. And the Byzantine coins were part of what they maintained, that kept them powerful as an economic entity and maintained their trade, was that they had coinage that was relied upon. Most of these coins had increments marked on them, particularly they're bronze, and so you'll find the largest coins typically have what looks to us like a M, a mu on it, which would represent 40. Then you have those that represent 20 with a K on them, those that represent 10, for example, with an iota on them, an I, and this would be the denomination, which would be on the reverse side of these coins. But the image of having a picture of Christ, who is seen by the Byzantines as God on the coins, would be something that would turn the Byzantines away from, not the Byzantines, the Muslims, away from using these coins because they rejected the deity of Christ. But using images was something that's going to grow to be an issue here in the 8th century, and in a period beginning in 726 and lasting until 787, and then again in the 9th century between 814 and 842, we'll find that there's an iconoclastic controversy. Should you use images of God, particularly of Jesus? The iconoclasts, the people who wanted to tear down any such images, were people who looked towards the Ten Commandments, and they saw there that the Israelites of old had been commanded not to make any graven images and not to make any idols. And so they thought that perhaps part of their troubles could come because they'd been making images, and so within some churches there'll be a destruction of icons, where images which had been increasingly popular, frescoes which had been put in churches, or mosaics sometimes on the walls depicting biblical scenes or saints, would be removed by the iconoclasts. Now, some people held on to these things. These would be particularly the iconodules, people who adored icons. And so there's a dispute that emerges here in the Middle Byzantine period. As people look at the context around the year 726 and try to explain why this would be the case, certainly Islam is posing a major challenge at this point in time, and something that's been discerned is that there had been a great tsunami in the Aegean at this point in time, and some people perhaps were discerning that this was God's judgment against them, and this was a response to that would be that they would try to bring about a divine pleasure by getting rid of these things. So Leo III, Byzantine emperor, would ban icons and order their destruction, and this would be an issue then that would separate some people within the eastern part of the old Roman Empire here in the Byzantine Empire. Particularly within the monasteries, we find that those people were iconodules. They maintained these, but that various emperors would hold to different positions until we come to a church council in the year 843, when the emperor installed a new patriarch in Constantinople, and that patriarch, who was connected with the monasteries, affirmed once again the use of icons. This will be a characteristic that continues in the Greek Orthodox churches and the denominations that come out of that tradition, like the Russian Orthodox Church, where they continue to use a lot of images in their worship. And this will be an ongoing challenge. As we come to the 9th century, here in this Middle Byzantine period, we find that there's a resurgence after ongoing erosion as the Muslims continue to peck away and chip away at Byzantine territory, with the coming of the Macedonian dynasty that's going to rule until the year 1056. It's a period of revival for the Byzantines, particularly led by the great warrior Basil I, beginning in 867. He's going to be a great warrior, and his contributions will be widely regarded. He's going to seek to restore a citizen army to the Byzantines rather than having just mercenaries who are paid to fight, and He's going to open up the bureaucracy of government, which is continuing to grow to all races, and he certainly demonstrates some diplomatic skill. He engages in a number of convenient marriage alliances and beneficial treaties, and as a result there's going to be some prosperity during his reign, and during his reign what we'll see is there'll be a revival of education in the promotion of higher education in Constantinople. You have the construction of the Great Hall, the Magna Aura. Now, they already had a university which was established in the time period of Theodosius II, but what we're going to find is that this education in Constantinople will continue to be promoted. And there's a number of important works that summarized earlier works and provided a history of the Byzantine Empire. So you have Michael Pacellus in his Chronographia, his Byzantine history, or the synopsis of Photius in his Myrobiblion. It's basically a synopsis of 1,000 books out of classical literature, and this is in fact our only way that we know anything about some ancient works in philosophy and mathematics and law and the like. Under the reign of Basil, given his prosperity, what we'll find is that the dome of Hagia Sophia, the great church dedicated to the Holy Spirit, would be rebuilt after it had collapsed in an earthquake. And because Basil is supportive of the use of icons, this is why you have icons that are still there that adorn that church building, as he used mosaic icons on the walls and ceilings of that structure. When Basil dies, the next great emperor is Basil II. Basil II is another warrior emperor who will crush rebellion, as various family members would sometimes conspire against him. And he inspired his warriors as he lived on the front, and he ate like his men and exposed himself to challenges. But while he's a great warrior, he's sometimes seen to be a person who neglects scholarship, unlike his predecessor. But he will be very successful in advancing the Byzantine frontiers, particularly into South Syria, and also over into the area that we know today as Bulgaria. And he'll make large gains against the Fatimids down. This is the Muslim group that's ruling down in Egypt. With advances in territory would come population growth, economic prosperity, and he's going to certainly supervise the use of weights and measures. He himself never married, and so he's not going to have any heirs himself, but he's going to marry his sister off, importantly, to Vladimir of Kiev, and this is going to promote the Christianization of the Rus, the Russians that come out of Kiev here, and a cultural connection that exists between the Byzantines and the Russians. And so the Eastern Church, speaking Greek and following its traditions, will be largely emulated in the Russian Orthodox Church that follows them amongst the descendants of Vladimir of Kiev. The family troubles that followed, though, would be because his heirs weren't cut from the same cloth, perhaps, where his heirs will see that the Normans, who we'll talk about, these Vikings, invade Sicily and Italy and seize territory that the Byzantines had claimed previously. Over in the east, the Seljuk Turks would arise in Asia Minor and press westward, and so the Macedonian dynasty, as it comes to an end, is one that's vulnerable, and what we find is that they lose some major battles against the Muslims, particularly in the year 1071 at Manzikert. This is going to lead them appealing to the West for aid, and the West will take its time, a couple of decades, in responding. The Byzantine Empire will continue on, but it will eventually come to be subjugated to Latin-speaking invaders for about 100 years following the Fourth Crusade, and only around the year 1260 revive in the late Byzantine period. They'll basically be revived for the last 200 years, where they'll continue to persist. These Byzantines are important in Western civilization, as they maintain many of the things that they inherited from Rome, and they'll pass these things on to those that come into contact with them, as there's going to be ongoing business contact with the Europeans to the west during the time period of the Fourth Crusade. There'll be lots of contacts that take place there, and the Venetians will establish a great deal of trade here with the Byzantines, and there'll be a lot of cultural influence that comes from the Byzantines as a result. In the area of religion, the Byzantines have certainly gone different directions than the Latin-speaking folks in the West on some issues. They continue to baptize individuals. They actually engage in a three-part baptism, where they baptize once in the name of the Father, once in the name of the Son, and once in the name of the Holy Spirit. They will baptize infants in that manner, and as Greek-speaking people, they understand the word baptizo to mean immerse, and so they never adopt the Western practice of accepting sprinkling as being a baptism. They will always immerse and continue to do that to this day. The area of religion is seen to be very important in this Byzantine time period, and they will create many structures. Churches are the major monumental architecture that are built in the Byzantine Empire. There are some other very large civic structures which are constructed, such as defensive walls, but church buildings are where they spend a lot of time and a lot of money, and it's interesting to think about this, why they would do that, why they would invest so much in this type of thing. What they viewed churches as being is an audience hall for the King of Kings. So when you go into church, basically a church is like stepping into the corner of heaven. It should look beautiful, it should smell nice, it should be clean, and be a lovely place. And so they're going to invest a lot of money in this. So I'm going to share with you a presentation that I've made that considers a church building that was built in this time period. I have excavated for a number of years at a city of the Decapolis called Abila. The Decapolis was a first century political and regional name, but under the Byzantines this area came to be known as Palestine, and particularly Abila was in the area of Palestinia Secunda. Palestine was divided up into 4 sections, and the capital city of Palestinia Secunda was the ancient Decapolis city of Scythopolis. And what you find in the region of the Decapolis is that there are many, many church buildings. This is true across the Byzantine Empire, and the particular church building that I'm going to take you to consider is one that was built in the early portion of the Byzantine Empire, and continues up until the year 749 when there's a massive earthquake. But this particular location is instructive on a number of things, and gets us into the mindset of these people that contribute greatly to Western civilization as they preserve many of the concepts that came that the Romans had embraced from various cultures, and they're going to pass these ideas back to the Latin West in the time period, particularly the Renaissance, when there's lots of scholars that flee from Byzantium to go west when the Muslims conquer the area, for example. So I'm going to give you a special lecture here today that would focus particularly on this church building that I've been excavating, and which you should recognize is that there have been a lot of people who've been worshiping Christ for a long time, but the church is becoming divided. Here, as we discuss the Byzantine Empire, I'd like to share with you something of the
research that I've done is I've excavated in Palestinia Secunda for many years, and so to bring you something of a report from the 2014 Abila expedition, and particularly the discoveries and observations that we've made in Area E at a multi-phase Byzantine structure, and I plan to present this when it's completed at San Diego at an annual meeting of the Archaeological Society, of which I'm a member. The 2014 excavation of structures at Abila has continued to expose the multi-phase structures that are in Area E and also in Area G, but it continues to show us something about the values of Byzantine society. Abila is located about 10 miles east of the south end of the Sea of Galilee, not too far away from the ancient site of Gadara. And if you go on Google Earth, you can find this site. You'll find it particularly by looking for the Roman bridge that crosses over the Wadi Quelba, and you can't get quite too terribly much resolution because it's not far from the Syrian border. But this old 1970s aerial picture was taken when things were much simpler and when the vegetation was much healthier than it is today, when they've been pumping off so much water to try and help the people of Jordan, this area. So you'll notice that in aerial pictures the vegetation will not be quite as lush as this. But as we look at Abila from the east looking westward, you can see that Roman road bridge crossing here, what we call the Roman road. It's actually certainly used in the Byzantine era, but comes from earlier Roman period. And in the center is Area E and the church that we're going to be looking at. There are a number of other structures that we've excavated at the site and others that we know about. Now, as we think about multi-phase churches, certainly we find that there are churches that Eusebius extols, particularly as they get imperial subsidy, building churches in the area we know today as Lebanon. But what we find is Eusebius talked in his Life of Constantine about the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre down in Jerusalem. So a veritable temple is created, something that would be worthy of God, and it was particularly ornate. So why in the world would you build church buildings? Certainly we'd understand building one in Jerusalem perhaps, but why at other places? Why would they copy structures like those in places like Jerusalem and imperial capitals? Well, certainly they want to honor God and to serve God, but they'll also serve the community in different ways and the groups that live in the community. And we'll find that sometimes people will build buildings because they want to gain personal renown as individuals, and this would motivate their construction. So we're going to look particularly at Area E, and in Area E what we find is an interesting five-aisled basilica that's built on the location of an earlier church. But this five-aisled basilica was destroyed by an earthquake, a great earthquake that took place in 749. It may have happened a couple of years earlier. We know that it happened at 11 o'clock in the morning in the springtime, but we don't know exactly which year. But this is a devastating earthquake to all of the cities that are in the area from Damascus southward, and is going to put an end to much of urban life in the society, particularly as there's, in conjunction with this, a move of the Umayyad world's leadership from Damascus to Abbasid, with the beginning to Baghdad, with the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate. So this building is one that was marked by having a white marble floor and having 5 aisles, and you can see that it has a very prominent apse. This is this curved structure where you have the most sacred spaces in the church building, delineated by a chancel screen, an area where you have the clergy that operate in this area, and the laity would be kept out of it. So this structure is one that has been known for some time, that we've excavated, and over the years, and I began excavating this in 2008. Here you have an aerial shot looking down on the apse, and can see this special space. As we look from that crane over the areas that was excavated, you can see that this is the basic surface of the Byzantine, the late Byzantine Umayyad church building, one that collapsed in this great earthquake. You can see the 4 rows of columns that support the roof over the 5 aisles, And this was a magnificent structure. As we look a little bit more closely down at this level, what we'll notice is that the area which was paved by marble was certainly a beautiful structure. This area was extended, however, by having a diaconicon on the south side of the building. And during 2006, when I first started excavating here, we excavated this diaconicon and discovered a number of interesting things which were there in this diaconicon. This is a service room that is to the south side of the church building here in Palestinia Secunda. This would be fairly normal. And as we excavated down, we found that it was reused by people after the earthquake who used the location as a domestic structure. And so they raised the floor using some of the rubble from the tumble and some of the ecclesiastical structures, and it was used for housing and for cooking bread and the like. As we excavate here, there's plenty of evidence that this was once a church, whether it's crosses carved in the walls or carved on the columns that were there. We found a large black stone which had these recesses cut into it, so it served as a reliquary. This is where they kept precious objects which were associated with a saint, and these were typically associated with an altar. So they're continuing to venerate saints in this time period. We don't know who this church was dedicated in honor of. Then there's this interesting structure that has a hole in the bottom that some have thought is perhaps a baptistry. Most interesting in this room, however, are the niches along the walls, which some people have thought might be evidence of the use of the structure as a mosque. Some of the evidence, however, like crosses, seem to mitigate against that. Was certainly used for this niche that's still preserved here and not walled up is one that was used as a kiln for some time and suffers from the effects of the high heat associated with that. What I noticed was that in these excavations was that there was a extension of the church. There were at about 5 meters from the apse. There were cracks which seemed to be unbonded, and so in subsequent season I excavated to establish that there were indeed these unbonded joints, which would point to the fact that the church had been enlarged from a 3-aisled basilica to a 5-aisled basilica. A 3-aisled basilica is quite normal. A 5-aisled basilica is a rare duck, which is typically associated with some sort of pilgrimage church to accommodate the people who would come to this location. So as a result, I did 3 probes at the end of the season, and those probes exposed in the middle nothing special, where you would hope to find the best mosaics. In the middle there was nothing that was down below, but we punched on down and found that we just had this matrix for the marble floor level. In the other areas, however, as we looked towards the squares to the north and the south and excavated down, we found that there was evidence of mosaic floors down below. And so we knew there were mosaic floors down about 1 meter below, and we'd have to wait for a season to come back to excavate those. So as we came back in 2010, we found that the area was thoroughly infested with thistles, and it was quite intimidating as you have thistles that are more than head high. But we knocked those down and began our excavation and cleared out the church building and began to excavate for these floors which lay below. And as we began here, you can see the marble paving from the Umayyad period church here after Islam has come following the Battle of Yarmouk. It's dominant in the area, and so the Umayyads are politically dominant. And you can see that from the earthquake that this thick marble floor had been shattered by falling columns and capitals, leaving a very fractured floor, which had subsequently largely been scavenged as they burned the marble to make lime, which they had other uses for. So this is the flooring that was from the Umayyad period church, and as we excavate down below, I was still hoping to find something in the center aisle, so we excavated units there, but as we excavated down, we would find evidence of earlier structures. In the center nave, we didn't find any floors, but we found that the floor had been removed, and down below that we found evidence of an earlier structure. Now, in the debris along the way, there was plenty of painted plaster pieces, lots of fragments that showed that there had been an earlier period church that had been highly decorated, and as we excavated on down, we found a number of things, but the most important things that we found were a plunge bath for a bathhouse. So before this had been a church site, there had been a bath which was oriented about 15 degrees off from the church. And so this is very interesting to see that this was continuing to be used for public functions, but the bath structure lay down below, and there was no mosaic floor in the central nave. But as we moved the side aisles, what we found is that we didn't get to go down to the level of that frigidarium in the bath. Instead, what we found was that there were these mosaic floors that we anticipated that we would find. In the south aisle, we found that the whole aisle was covered with mosaic floors, and you can see the patterns that are depicted there. Two different patterns separated by lozenges that have Christian iconography. You see lots of crosses, and this would be a typical symbol. Some don't think that crosses and floors are very common because people didn't want to step on crosses, but at Abila they appeared not to have too much trepidation about that. Moving from the south aisle, we'll move here. You can see the complete aisle as it was excavated, and as we took pictures from the columns above, we could see the whole structure. But amongst things we found buried in this material was earlier liturgical remains from an earlier chancel where they had separated space, and so this is evidence, of something that had gone before, which was no longer being used, and so they used it in the fill underneath. But what does one do with spare pieces of liturgical architecture? It might cause some problems. In our excavations, we also found some burials where people were buried in this church at a later time period here, perhaps because this was sacred space that their families remembered in some way, even after this church was destroyed by earthquake. And so this south aisle has a very ornate mosaic with this galoche, this braided edge around it, and it's really quite an ornate structure. And so as we finish that season, we certainly scraped the area clean. It's no longer filled with thistles, and yet we have lots of questions to go in future seasons. As we excavated the north aisle, similar sorts of things. Again, we found geometric patterns in the mosaics, which would point to these as being Byzantine period mosaics that certainly wouldn't have been offensive to the Muslims who came in the 7th century. These are simpler to make than the pictorial mosaics, but these are sometimes known as carpet mosaics. The aisle once again has lozenges by the doorways and lots of crosses along the way in the floor. In 2012, we focused on excavating in the atrium of the church, where work had gone on earlier, but we wanted to extend this area to an area where we saw a niche in a wall that was indicative of a chapel. And as we excavated there, we would find more floors. We also did work in the diaconicon and further clarified that location. But in the atrium, we have flooring which had been removed earlier from the central part of the church with large paving stones. Now, you and I might think mosaics are particularly dandy, but in the later Byzantine period, large colored stones are much more appreciated. And so what was evident in the church was that, first of all, there had been a white mosaic, a rather plain mosaic, that had been used in the church, and then subsequently there had been these large pavers, but when they put the marble floor in, they removed these large pavers and used them in the atrium instead. And so these are remnants that are recycled from the earlier church. They continue to have a use for these. And they would surround this courtyard where the bishop would hold court and act as something of a local judge and also as an imperial official. And so as we excavated this, we moved to the side to find another cistern and a chapel. Again, no clear indication as to what saint might have been venerated at that chapel. We excavated this area, which showed that there had actually been a number of changes along the way. There's several phases here where chancel screens were moved around, and the area was variously reused. But it's decorated by these very large pavers in a checkerboard pattern of colored stone. Remember, this is more valued than those little mosaics. Here you're showing off in that you're showing that you can use expensive colored stones, not just little bits of them. You're using large slabs of stone which are well preserved in this area. And so from above you can see that checkerboard pattern in the chapel, and the this is quite an ornate display on their part. Now, as we came in that chapel area, there was found a blue glazed piece, which was rather surprising because we typically identify this with an 8th century, a 9th century type of strata, but this was found here amongst the earthquake debris, which is rather interesting. Now, as we excavated in the adjacent room to the south, we found we were actually kind of disappointed, but we found lots of evidence of oil lamps from Candelaria, and it seems to have been largely an unfinished room at the time of the earthquake. But to the north side of the church building, there was a promise of very deep strata, and that's where we went in 2014. And as we excavated 4 squares there, we excavated the roadway between the church and the atrium as it proceeded northward, and also structures along the north side of the church, which were buried under more than 3 meters of debris. Again, lots of construction collapsed debris from the earthquake, and in the process we found that there were 2 mosaic floors that we exposed, and it showed that this area had seen years of changes over time, and that there was a processional way that moved away to the north, and there will be more excavations that will be needed in the future to expose these new mosaic areas. But as we look at this church building that's used for years and years, it's kind of interesting to think about what's going on here, where we have multiple different floor levels, but this is something that's found in many places, even within the region of the modern-day country of Jordan, but in Palestinia Secunda and in neighboring provinces like Arabia. And so in places like Amman, ancient Philadelphia, and Ain Musa, ancient Heshbon, in places like Pella, we find there are multiple places where there are multiple layers of floor in a church building. So why in the world do you have multiple layers of church floors? Well, it all comes tied up with people trying to make significant gifts, and sometimes styles change and people just want to change the look and spruce things up. They want to give a gift to God, and this is the way that a family or a clan or a city might adorn something. And particularly at Abila, they're adorning this church as it appears to be a pilgrimage church, perhaps associated with the prophet Elijah. We'll find that there will be some traditions that assert that Abila is the location of the Kinnereth Brook where Elijah was fed by a raven. So maybe this was a pilgrimage church, and they asserted that this is where that was taking place. But there's tensions here between church ornamentation and charity. And this emerges back in the 4th century. We see this in the time of Jerome and others in the 4th century. And Jerome wrote that some may build churches and adorn their walls with marble and procure massive columns and decorate them with precious metals. And he judges, I don't blame these who do these things. Everyone must follow his own judgment. And certainly it's better to spend one's money that way than to hoard it and brood over it. But in his directive to Demetrius, he told him, your duty is of a different kind. Yours is to clothe Christ in the poor, to visit him in the sick, to feed him in the hungry, and shelter him in the homeless. What we'll find is that some monks are going to find that ornamentation of churches is rather ostentatious, and that money might be better spent in taking care of people as they are the temple of God. This was a view that was shared by Cyril of Jerusalem, who in a time of famine and earthquake responded to the plight of the masses by selling a resource that he had and giving it to the poor. But in doing so, what we find is that he gets in trouble from patrons who had given gifts to the church that he had sold, particularly when he sold some ornamented cloth, and a man who had made that gift saw that cloth in the clothing of an actress, and subsequently we're going to find Cyril was actually deposed from his office as a result. So this is an issue between clerics sometimes and people who gave gifts. They wanted their gifts to be seen and for their name to be appreciated in the church. This is not just a problem in the Byzantine East, it's also in the West, as we find Ambrose of Milan was questioned sometime for his sale of precious metals in a time of need. Further to the north around Antioch, John Chrysostom is going to make this same kind of assertion. And this is still a question today. What do we value? Do we want to have gold-plated locations, or do we want to take care of the needy? But as we look at multiple church floors in Byzantine churches in Jordan, certainly people wanted to make gifts that would adorn churches and have them as suitable audience halls for the King of Kings. Oftentimes people want to give gifts that will be lasting gifts, so they don't want something that will be liquidated, and so church buildings and church floors would point towards that. And so as a result, we'll have lots of church buildings that are built, and they're going to spend a great deal of money along the way. And when you do this, then what do you do with those things which had been given as gifts to God? Now, this is not just an ancient issue, it's also a modern issue. At the time of my grandfather's death, my grandmother gave pulpit furniture to the congregation where they had worshipped, a church building that was built on land that her family, a generation before, had given for the construction of a church facility. And she was quite distressed when they decided to move from that country location out near the highway to a better location. And they left that building, and was even more distressed when that church building was razed, when it was torn down. And they took the pulpit furniture with them to the new location, and that was fine. But eventually they decided they didn't want to have that old oak furniture. So the question is, what would they do with it? They would make her and others who'd given gifts upset if they just put them out for the garbage people to take away. And so happily they were able to give them to another congregation, a new congregation that was starting, and so they used that pulpit furniture. Well, this is a problem sometimes. What do you do when you want to renovate a structure, or you want to reuse floor space, or repair something that's damaged? Sometimes you can cause troubles with people as you progress along the way. So it's hard sometimes to get rid of gifts that had been given. There may be valid reasons for that, but the rationale is one that that varies. So why are there multiple layers of mosaic? Well, that's because subsequent patrons want to give a significant gift to the church, and they might bury things instead of tearing them up. If you elevate the floor higher, maybe it helps drainage to be better, and it's kind of like keeping Grandma's old quilt in the closet someplace. It's still in the church building, it's part of the patrimony of the church, and you don't annoy the people who, the descendants of the people who gave that floor at an earlier generation. So here at Abila, by preserving earlier floors under fill, That way they continue to honor the gift, and I suppose if they wanted them, they could dig them up and look at them. But we have multiple layers of floor because you have ongoing generations using the same facility, and sometimes earthquakes might damage things, or there might be the desire to expand a facility or to repurpose a location. Generally, it continues to be used as sacred space, and as they move from one place to another or add on to a building, sometimes there's a need to repurpose chapels and structures to serve the ongoing needs of a congregation. So there's a whole lot that continues on in the Byzantine Empire, and this excavation at Abila shows just how long things are going on and how over the generations people continue to worship. Sometimes they develop traditions along the way which deviate from earlier traditions, but these churches continue to be used as sacred space and to be respected as such, and sometimes valuable things can be repurposed and reused. Sometimes they get covered up in the process as new walls are built and structures are expanded. Well, I hope that this little excursion has been interesting to you and was something of a benefit here in our lecture number 14. What we're going to continue to do next time is to move here into this area of the Byzantine Empire and see what happens in those areas which are taken over by the Muslims as they expand in this area, and they're going to embrace things Roman and at the same time bring some cultural contributions which will subsequently influence the Latin West and the development of Western civilization. The Byzantines here have preserved many things. Long-distance trade, reliable coinage, and architectural achievement, which will inspire things over in the West over time. Particularly as we're going to see later that the Crusaders come to the East and see these things and take these ideas back West with them. Thank you for your attention.